The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. Red light filled the small observation pod, and my hands froze over the controls. I was Vexthal Corrin, an officer of the Dominion fleet, and in that single moment, every assumption I carried about the species called humans began to crumble. I had arrived at the Joint Staging Outpost only 3 days earlier, sent by my superiors to watch and record. The Dominion had fought wars across 100 star systems. We had catalogued thousands of species, ranked them by strength, by cunning, by the shape of their fear. Humans were filed under a simple label: soft, young, emotional. A species barely 3 centuries removed from tribal conflict on their homeworld, now somehow walking among the stars with the rest of us, blinking in confusion like children who had wandered into a room full of adults. My orders were clear. Observe the human deployment alongside coalition forces, document their weaknesses, send back a report that would confirm what every Dominion strategist already believed, that humans were a liability, dressed up as an ally, kept around only because the coalition needed their numbers and their strange, restless energy. I did not expect to feel unease that day. I did not expect anything at all, if I am honest. I expected boredom, and perhaps a small measure of contempt. The outpost itself was called Halden Station, a modest structure built into the side of an asteroid, near the edge of contested space. It served as a staging point for coalition forces preparing to defend a nearby mining colony from Krail Ascendancy raiders. The Krail were an old enemy of the Dominion, patient and merciless, a species that measured victory in generations rather than battles. We had learned to respect them the hard way, through centuries of loss. When I stepped off the transport shuttle, the first human I met was a young officer named Daniel Cole. He greeted me with an outstretched hand, a gesture I did not understand at first. Dominion soldiers greet each other with a bow of the head and a fixed stare, a display of discipline and control. Daniel simply smiled and extended his hand as though we were old friends meeting for a meal. "You must be the observer," he said. "Colonel Reyes told us to expect you." "Don't worry, we don't bite." I did not know what to make of that comment. I recorded it anyway, unsure if it was meant as reassurance or a joke I did not understand. Humans, I would soon learn, often said things that meant nothing on the surface and everything underneath. He led me through the station, and I studied everything with the trained eye of an intelligence officer. The corridors were narrower than Dominion vessels, cluttered with personal items that had no place in a military installation. A soldier had pinned photographs of what appeared to be a family to the wall near her bunk. Another had a small plant growing in a cup near a console, something green and stubborn against the gray metal walls. None of this matched what a properly run military force should look like. I met Colonel Reyes in the command center that evening. She was a woman of average height, with tired eyes, and a voice that carried authority, without needing to be raised. She did not salute in the rigid Dominion fashion. She simply nodded and gestured for me to sit. "I read the request from your government," she said. "You want to watch us fight? Fine. Just stay out of the way when things get difficult. I have been assured that human forces are well prepared for the engagement ahead," I said, choosing my words carefully, the way Dominion officers were trained to speak, revealing nothing. She almost smiled at that. "Prepared is a strong word. We do what we can with what we have." I found her answer strange. A commander should project confidence, not doubt. I noted this in my log as another mark against human military competence. It would not be the last time I misjudged something I did not yet understand. Over the following 2 days, I observed the human soldiers preparing for the coming engagement. Their methods baffled me. There was no rigid formation drilling, no repeated recitation of tactical doctrine, no silence enforced during meal hours. Instead, I saw soldiers laughing together in the mess hall, telling stories that made no logical sense to me, slapping each other on the back, and eating together in loud groups rather than in disciplined rows. One evening, I watched a group of them sing together, before what I understood to be a difficult training exercise. Their voices rose and fell in odd harmony, and some of them laughed halfway through the song, forgetting the words and making up new ones on the spot. I sat in the corner of the room, recording everything, utterly convinced that this behavior signaled weak discipline, poor morale, or perhaps outright denial of the danger they faced. I brought my observations to Colonel Reyes the next morning. Your soldiers do not appear to take the coming conflict seriously, I said. Their behavior suggests low morale, or a lack of discipline. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that made me feel I had said something foolish, without understanding why. You've got it backwards, she said. That's not low morale. That's how we carry the weight. If we sat around in silence, staring at the walls, thinking about what's coming, half of us would fall apart before the first shot is even fired. The laughing, the singing, the stupid jokes. That's how humans process fear. We don't pretend it isn't there. We just refuse to let it own us. I did not fully understand her explanation, but I recorded it in my log as a curiosity rather than a warning. In hindsight, I should have paid closer attention. I should have asked more questions. Instead, I filed it away with the same dismissive certainty that had shaped every report the Dominion had ever written about humanity. That afternoon, sensors detected a large concentration of Krail vessels moving toward the mining colony we were assigned to protect. The station shifted into a state of readiness that Dominion protocols would have called chaotic. Human soldiers moved quickly, but without the mechanical precision I was used to. Orders were shouted, questions were asked and answered in seconds, and somehow, despite what looked like disorder to my eyes, everyone ended up exactly where they needed to be. I stood near the command center, watching Colonel Reyes coordinate the defense. She spoke to her officers with a calm that did not match the urgency of the situation. Yet her instructions were sharp and clear. I noticed something else too. She used the names of her soldiers when giving orders, not ranks or designations. She called out to a young woman named Grace Bennett, telling her to reposition a sensor array, and to a man named Henry Cross, instructing him to check the outer perimeter defenses. Each order was personal, almost intimate, nothing like the detached commands issued by Dominion officers to nameless subordinates. I asked her about this later, curious despite myself. Why do you use their names instead of their ranks? Because they're not just ranks to me, she said. They're people. If I forget that, even for a second, I stop being the kind of commander they can trust with their lives. I wrote this down as well, though I still did not grasp its significance. I was beginning to sense that something about human behavior did not fit the models I had been trained to use, but I could not yet name what it was. As night fell over the station, or what passed for night in the artificial lighting cycle, I found myself unable to record further observations. I sat alone in the small quarters assigned to me, reviewing the data I had gathered so far. According to every measure the Dominion used to evaluate military readiness, the human forces at Halden Station were disorganized, undisciplined, and emotionally unstable. My draft report practically wrote itself, confirming everything my superiors expected to hear. Yet something nagged at me, a small doubt I could not silence. I thought of Colonel Reyes's steady voice as she gave orders using the names of her soldiers. I thought of the laughter in the mess hall, the singing that seemed to release tension rather than ignore it, the strange comfort humans found in speaking openly about fear instead of burying it beneath cold discipline. I told myself these were simply cultural differences, nothing more. The coming battle would reveal the truth, I decided. It would show whether human softness translated into weakness on the battlefield, or whether there was something else hiding beneath the surface, something my training had never prepared me to recognize. I did not sleep well that night. Through the narrow window of my quarters, I watched distant lights moving in the darkness beyond the station, the first signs of the Krail fleet approaching. Whatever answers I sought, I understood that I would not have to wait much longer to find them. The station's alert system pulsed low and steady in the background, a reminder that time was running out. Somewhere down the corridor, I could hear muffled voices, calm despite the danger closing in from the void outside. It was a strange kind of quiet, unlike anything the Dominion taught its soldiers to create before battle. There was no forced silence, no rigid stillness. Instead, there was a soft hum of ordinary conversation, as though the humans around me had decided that fear did not deserve the final word. I closed my eyes, uncertain what the coming days would bring, but certain of one thing. My understanding of humanity, so carefully built on generations of Dominion reports and cold statistics, was about to be tested in ways I could not yet imagine. The first tremor came just before dawn's cycle, a distant shudder that rattled the walls of the station and sent every soldier sprinting toward their post. I rose from my seat in the observation pod, heart racing with an unfamiliar sensation that I would later understand was something close to fear. The Krail fleet had arrived sooner than our sensors predicted, and the calm days of preparation were over. What followed would change everything I believed about the species the Dominion had dismissed for so long. The Krail fleet emerged from the darkness in a formation I recognized immediately, a pattern designed to overwhelm smaller defensive positions through sheer numbers rather than clever strategy. Dozens of vessels, sharp and angular, cut through the black void toward Halden Station and the mining colony it protected. I had studied the Krail for years, but seeing their ships approach with my own eyes felt different from any simulation or historical record. Colonel Reyes stood at the center of the command deck, her eyes fixed on the tactical display. She did not shout. She did not panic. She simply raised her voice enough to be heard across the room and began issuing orders with the same calm precision I had noticed the day before. "All defensive positions. Hold your ground until my signal," she said. "Grace, I need eyes on their lead formation. Henry, keep that perimeter shield stable no matter what happens." I stood near the back of the command deck, recording everything, though my hands trembled slightly as I adjusted my equipment. Dominion training taught us to remain still under pressure, to let our bodies obey our minds without hesitation. Yet here I was, shaking despite years of discipline, while the humans around me moved with a strange, steady purpose that seemed to grow stronger as the danger increased. The first exchange of fire lit up the void outside the station's viewports. Streaks of light crossed the darkness as defensive turrets activated, meeting the approaching Krail vessels with a wall of resistance. I had expected the human formation to buckle almost immediately. According to Dominion doctrine, a numerically inferior force facing an aggressive assault should begin an orderly withdrawal within the first few minutes, preserving what forces remained for a later stand. That is not what happened. Instead, the human ships adjusted their positions in ways that defied the strategies I had studied for years. Rather than retreating into a defensive cluster, several vessels broke away from the main formation entirely, moving into positions that appeared reckless and disorganized. I watched, certain that I was witnessing the beginning of a collapse, the very weakness my report was meant to confirm. A young pilot named Peter Lang, whose voice I recognized from the mess hall the night before, called out over the comm system with something that sounded almost like excitement rather than fear. "I've got an opening on their left flank, requesting permission to engage." Colonel Reyes did not hesitate. "Permission granted. Watch your six." I turned to the officer standing nearest to me, a woman named Ellen Marsh, who monitored the tactical display with intense focus. "This formation makes no sense," I said, unable to keep the confusion out of my voice. "Why would you divide your forces against a superior number of enemy ships?" She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "Because the Krail expect us to bunch up and defend. They've fought defensive formations 100 times before." "This isn't that." I did not understand what she meant, not fully, not yet. I watched as Peter Lang's small vessel darted through the chaos of battle, weaving between incoming fire with movements that seemed almost impossible, given the ship's limited maneuverability. He struck the flank of the lead Krail vessel with a precision that caught the enemy formation off guard, forcing them to adjust their approach at the worst possible moment. The Krail commander, whoever he was, clearly expected a straightforward confrontation. Instead, he found himself facing an enemy that refused to behave according to any pattern his species had encountered before. I began to understand, slowly, that what I had mistaken for disorganization was something far more deliberate. The humans were not failing to follow a plan. They were improvising one in real time, adapting to the situation faster than I believed possible for any organic mind. Hours passed in what felt like moments, the battle stretching across the void in waves of advance and retreat. I lost count of how many times the tactical situation shifted entirely, how many times a maneuver that seemed reckless turned into an advantage moments later. Colonel Reyes remained at the center of it all, calm and steady, her voice never rising even as the situation grew more desperate. At one point, a section of the outer defense line began to fail under sustained pressure from a group of Krail vessels that had broken through the main formation. I watched the tactical display with growing alarm, certain that this was the moment the human defense would collapse entirely. Instead, I heard Colonel Reyes speak into the comm system, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding her. "Henry, I need that shield holding for another 2 minutes. Can you give me that?" There was a pause, static crackling over the line, and then Henry Cross's voice returned, strained but determined. "I'll give you 3. I did not understand the significance of that exchange at the time. It seemed like an ordinary tactical conversation, nothing more. It was only later, once I understood more about human nature, that I realized what I had witnessed. Henry Cross was not simply following an order. He was making a promise, one he intended to keep no matter the cost to himself. The shield held. Somehow, against all odds, the outer defense line stabilized just long enough for the human forces to regroup and launch a counterattack that caught the Krail formation completely off guard. I watched as ships that had seemed scattered and vulnerable only minutes before suddenly converged with startling coordination, striking at weak points in the enemy formation that I had not even noticed developing. It was during this counterattack that I first began to feel something shift inside me, a growing unease that had nothing to do with the physical danger surrounding the station. I realized that everything I had been taught about humanity, every report I had read, every assumption I had carried into this assignment, was built on a fundamental misunderstanding. The Dominion had studied human military doctrine and found it lacking in the rigid structures we valued so highly. What we had failed to study, what perhaps could not be studied through simple observation of formations and tactics, was the way humans thought and adapted under pressure. Their strength did not come from following a plan perfectly. It came from their ability to abandon a plan the moment it stopped working, and to create a new one on the spot, drawing on some combination of instinct and experience that I could not fully explain even as I watched it unfold before me. Colonel Reyes turned to me at one point during a brief lull in the fighting, her face marked with exhaustion, but her eyes still sharp and focused. "You're recording all of this?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Though I confess, much of what I am witnessing does not match my expectations." She allowed herself a tired smile. "Good. Maybe your people will finally understand that we're not just along for the ride." I wanted to ask her more, to understand the source of this strange resilience that seemed to grow stronger the more desperate the situation became. But the battle demanded her attention once again, and I was left with only my thoughts and the growing realization that my original report would need to be rewritten entirely. As the fighting continued into what humans called the second hour of engagement, I noticed something else that troubled me deeply. Despite the chaos and danger surrounding them, the human soldiers continued to communicate with each other in ways that seemed almost casual, checking on one another's well-being even in the middle of active combat. A soldier named Alice Dunn, stationed near one of the secondary defense turrets, called out to a colleague simply to ask if he was still breathing steady, a phrase I did not fully understand, but recognized as some form of concern for another person's emotional state during crisis. This behavior contradicted everything Dominion training emphasized. We were taught that emotional connections between soldiers created vulnerabilities, weaknesses that an enemy could exploit. Yet here, in the middle of one of the most chaotic engagements I had ever witnessed, these connections seemed to be doing the opposite. They seemed to be holding the human formation together, giving each soldier a reason to keep fighting, even when the odds appeared impossible. The Krail fleet, sensing an opportunity as the human defense continued to shift and adapt in unpredictable ways, began to concentrate their remaining forces on a single point along the station's perimeter, clearly hoping to break through with overwhelming force, rather than continue facing a defense they could not properly predict. I watched the tactical display with growing tension, uncertain whether the human forces could withstand a concentrated assault after already enduring hours of continuous engagement. Colonel Reyes studied the same display, her expression unreadable for a long moment before she spoke. "They're getting desperate," she said, more to herself than to anyone else in the room. "Good. Desperate enemies make mistakes." I did not share her confidence. According to every calculation I could make, the human forces were stretched dangerously thin, their resources dwindling with each passing minute. Yet she seemed almost relieved by the enemy's change in strategy, as though she had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Prepare for a full engagement," she announced over the comm system, her voice carrying a new edge of determination that had not been present before. "This is where we decide how this ends." I felt a chill move through me as I listened to her words, uncertain whether I was witnessing the final stand of a doomed defense or the beginning of something I did not yet understand. Around me, human soldiers moved with renewed focus, their earlier casualness replaced by a quiet intensity that seemed to fill the entire station. Whatever was about to happen, I understood that it would answer the questions I had carried with me since arriving at Halden Station. Was humanity truly as soft and unprepared as the Dominion believed, or had we all been looking at the wrong measure of strength entirely? The battle raging outside the station's walls was about to provide an answer, one way or another, and I found myself watching with a strange mixture of dread and fascination as the Krail fleet prepared for their final assault. The Krail commander made his move without warning, directing nearly every remaining vessel toward a single stretch of the station's perimeter defenses. I watched the tactical display flood with red markers, dozens of enemy signatures converging on a point that suddenly seemed far too small to withstand what was coming. My earlier confidence, the small hope I had begun to feel watching the human defense adapt and improvise, faded as I calculated the odds facing the outnumbered station. Colonel Reyes did not flinch. She stood at the center of the command deck, her eyes moving across the display with the focus of someone who had already seen this moment coming, as though she had been waiting for the enemy to overcommit exactly this way. "They think we're finished," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Let's show them otherwise." She began issuing orders in rapid succession, her voice cutting through the noise of the command deck with absolute clarity. Ships that had been scattered across the battlefield in what appeared to be a defensive posture suddenly began converging toward the threatened perimeter, moving with a coordination that seemed impossible given how spread out they had been only moments before. I struggled to understand the strategy unfolding before me. According to everything I had learned, concentrating forces to meet a concentrated assault was a basic and predictable response, one that any competent enemy commander would anticipate. Yet something about the way the human ships moved suggested there was more happening beneath the surface than a simple defensive maneuver. Peter Lang's voice crackled over the comm system, tense but controlled. "I'm seeing gaps forming in their formation as they converge. They're moving faster than expected but leaving their rear exposed." "I see it," Colonel Reyes replied. "Grace, Henry, take your squadrons around their flank the moment that gap widens. Everyone else, hold the line and make them pay for every inch." I finally understood what I was witnessing. The human forces were not simply reacting to the Krail assault. They were deliberately allowing the enemy to overextend, drawing them into a position where their numerical advantage would become a liability rather than a strength. It was a calculated risk, one that required immense confidence in the ability of individual pilots and soldiers to hold their positions under intense pressure while waiting for the right moment to strike. The Krail fleet crashed into the human perimeter like a wave against rock, and for a moment, it seemed as though the defensive line would simply be swept away by the sheer force of the assault. Explosions of light filled the void outside the station, and the sound of the station itself groaning under the strain of nearby impacts sent a fresh wave of tension through everyone on the command deck. I watched as a section of the perimeter shield flickered and nearly failed, the soldiers stationed there scrambling to reroute power and stabilize the defense before it collapsed entirely. Alice Dunn's voice came through the comm system, strained with effort. "Shield integrity at 40% and dropping. I need more power. Redirected to this section now." "You've got it," came the reply from somewhere deeper in the station, and moments later, the shield stabilized just enough to hold against the continued assault. Throughout all of this, I noticed something that struck me as deeply strange. Despite the danger surrounding them, despite the very real possibility that the station could fall within minutes, the human soldiers continued to communicate with a kind of dark humor that seemed entirely out of place given the circumstances. Someone made a joke about the quality of the station's food supplies even as they worked frantically to keep the shields online, and several voices on the comm system responded with laughter that sounded genuine, despite the tension in every word. I began to understand, slowly and with growing clarity, that this behavior was not a sign of weakness or poor discipline as I had originally believed. It was something closer to armor, a way of keeping fear from overwhelming judgment, even in the most desperate moments. The humans around me were not ignoring the danger they faced. They were choosing, deliberately, not to let it control them. As the assault continued, Grace Bennett's squadron completed their flanking maneuver, striking the exposed rear of the Krail formation with a precision that caught the enemy commander completely off guard. I watched the tactical display shift dramatically as several Krail vessels broke away from the main assault, forced to redirect their attention toward this new and unexpected threat. "Their formation is breaking," Ellen Marsh called out from her station, a note of cautious hope entering her voice for the first time since the battle began. Colonel Reyes did not celebrate prematurely. "Keep the pressure on. Don't let them regroup." The next several minutes passed in a blur of chaotic engagement, ships moving, and firing in patterns too fast for me to fully track, even with the assistance of my recording equipment. What became clear, however, was that the tide of the battle had shifted decisively in favor of the human defense. The Krail fleet, so confident in their concentrated assault, found themselves caught between the main defensive line and the flanking squadrons that had appeared seemingly out of nowhere. It was during this critical phase of the battle that I witnessed something that would remain with me long after I left Halden Station. A small group of human soldiers, cut off from the main defensive line during the chaos of the engagement, found themselves surrounded and vastly outnumbered near one of the station's secondary access points. Their position was hopeless by any reasonable military calculation, their retreat cut off by damaged corridors and failing systems. I heard the transmission come through the command deck speakers, a young soldier's voice tight with controlled fear but steady nonetheless. "This is Owen Blake, requesting immediate extraction. We're pinned down and running low on options here." Colonel Reyes's face tightened, and for the first time since the battle began, I saw something close to genuine worry cross her features. "Owen, I need you to hold that position. If you fall back now, you'll expose the entire secondary corridor and everyone behind it." There was a pause on the comm line, long enough that I wondered if the connection had failed entirely. When Owen Blake's voice returned, it carried a weight that I would come to understand as one of the defining characteristics of human courage. "Understood, Colonel. We'll hold as long as we can." I did not fully grasp the significance of that exchange in the moment. It was only as I watched the tactical display, seeing the small group of soldiers remain in their impossible position despite every opportunity to withdraw, that I began to understand what I was witnessing. These were not soldiers following orders out of blind obedience or fear of punishment. They were making a conscious choice to remain in danger, knowing full well the risk involved, because they understood that their sacrifice would protect others who depended on their position holding firm. The minutes that followed felt like hours. I watched the small group of soldiers continue to hold their position against increasingly difficult odds, their voices occasionally crackling over the comm system with updates that grew more strained with each passing moment. Yet even in the midst of this desperate defense, I heard moments of dark humor pass between them, small jokes exchanged, to keep spirits from breaking entirely under the pressure. Colonel Reyes worked frantically to coordinate a relief effort, redirecting available forces toward the secondary access point, while continuing to manage the broader battle unfolding across the station's perimeter. I watched her make decision after decision under conditions that would have overwhelmed any system I had studied, her focus never wavering despite the personal stakes involved in the outcome. "Grace, I need you to break off and support Owen's position," she said. "Can your squadron make it there in time?" Grace Bennett's response came without hesitation. "We're already moving, Colonel." I watched the tactical display as Grace's squadron changed course, cutting through the chaos of the ongoing battle to reach the beleaguered group of soldiers before their position could be overrun entirely. The maneuver required threading through active combat zones, dodging both enemy fire and the debris of destroyed vessels scattered throughout the void surrounding the station. The relief arrived with only moments to spare. I watched as Grace's squadron struck the Krail forces surrounding the secondary access point, creating enough of a distraction to allow Owen Blake and his small group of soldiers to finally withdraw to safety. The relief in Colonel Reyes's voice was evident even through the professional calm she maintained throughout the exchange. "Owen, status report." "We're clear, Colonel. Everyone's accounted for." I noticed something in that moment that struck me deeply. The relief on the command deck was not simply tactical satisfaction at a successful maneuver. It was something more personal, a genuine concern for the well-being of specific individuals, rather than an abstract calculation of remaining military assets. Several officers around me exhaled visibly, tension leaving their shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with the overall progress of the battle, and everything to do with the safety of people they clearly cared about. As the main engagement continued to shift decisively in favor of the human defense, I found myself reflecting on everything I had witnessed over the past several hours. The Krail commander, sensing that his forces were being systematically dismantled through a combination of adaptive tactics and stubborn resilience, began to pull back the remaining ships under his command, clearly recognizing that continued engagement would only result in further losses without any realistic path to victory. Colonel Reyes watched the enemy formation begin its retreat with an expression that carried more exhaustion than triumph. "Let them go," she said quietly. "We've made our point." I turned to her, unable to contain the questions that had been building within me throughout the entire engagement. "You could have pursued them. Why allow them to retreat?" She looked at me for a long moment before answering, her eyes carrying a weight of experience that I was only beginning to understand. "Because this isn't about destroying every enemy we face. It's about protecting what matters and knowing when enough is enough. We didn't come here to prove how dangerous we can be. We came here to keep that mining colony safe." Her words settled into my mind with unexpected weight. I had arrived at Halden Station expecting to document weakness, to confirm the Dominion's long-held belief that humanity represented a soft and unreliable element within the broader coalition forces. Instead, I had witnessed something entirely different, a form of strength that did not rely on overwhelming force or rigid adherence to doctrine, but on adaptability, personal connection, and a willingness to make impossible choices when circumstances demanded it. As the last of the Krail vessels retreated into the darkness beyond the station's sensors, a quiet settled over the command deck that felt different from the tension that had preceded it. It was not simply relief at surviving the engagement. It was something closer to a shared understanding among the soldiers present, a recognition of what they had accomplished together, against odds that had seemed impossible only hours before. I remained at my station, continuing to record the aftermath of the battle, though my thoughts had drifted far beyond simple observation. Everything I had believed about humanity before arriving at Halden Station now seemed hopelessly inadequate, built on assumptions that had never been properly tested against the reality of human behavior under genuine pressure. Colonel Reyes moved through the command deck, checking on her officers individually, offering quiet words of acknowledgement to those who had performed well during the engagement. I watched her pause beside Owen Blake, who had returned to the command deck still visibly shaken from his earlier ordeal near the secondary access point. "You did good, Owen," she said simply. He nodded, though I could see the exhaustion in his posture, a physical manifestation of the fear he had faced and somehow overcome during those critical minutes when his position had seemed impossible to hold. "Just doing what needed doing, Colonel." I found myself struck by the simplicity of that statement, the quiet acceptance of danger and sacrifice as simply part of what needed to be done, rather than some extraordinary act deserving of special recognition. It was a mindset that seemed to run through every human soldier I had observed during the engagement, a shared understanding that their individual safety mattered less than the safety of the group as a whole. As the station began the slow process of assessing damage and preparing reports for Coalition Command, I remained on the command deck, watching the human soldiers around me return to something resembling normal routine, despite everything they had just endured. The dark humor returned, quieter now but still present, a coping mechanism that had carried them through the worst of the engagement and would presumably continue to carry them through whatever challenges awaited in the future. I understood, in that moment, that my original report to Dominion Command would need to be entirely rewritten. The species we had dismissed as soft and unreliable had just demonstrated a form of resilience and tactical creativity that exceeded anything our rigid doctrine had prepared us to expect. Whatever conclusions I drew from this experience, I knew they would challenge everything the Dominion believed about the newest members of the coalition forces. The battle for Halden Station was over, but I sensed that my understanding of humanity was only beginning to take shape, built on a foundation far more complex than the simple statistics and battlefield formations I had arrived expecting to study. In the hours following the retreat of the Krail fleet, Halden Station transformed from a battlefield into something closer to a place of quiet reflection. I walked through the corridors with my recording equipment still active, documenting the aftermath with the same careful attention I had given to the engagement itself, though the nature of what I observed had shifted entirely. Soldiers moved through the station checking on equipment, tending to minor injuries, and slowly beginning the process of processing what they had just survived. I passed by the medical bay and saw Owen Blake sitting quietly, while a medic examined a small wound on his arm, the injury minor, compared to what could have happened, given the danger he had faced near the secondary access point. "How are you feeling?" the medic asked him, her voice carrying genuine concern, rather than mere procedural obligation. "Better now," Owen replied, offering a tired smile. "Ask me again, once the shaking stops." I found myself pausing outside the medical bay, struck once again by the honesty with which humans seemed to discuss their own vulnerability. Dominion soldiers were trained to suppress any outward sign of fear or distress, viewing such displays as a failure of discipline. Yet here, admitting to lingering fear after surviving a dangerous engagement seemed to be treated as perfectly normal, even expected. I made my way back toward the command deck, where Colonel Reyes remained despite the late hour, reviewing reports and coordinating with Coalition Command regarding the aftermath of the engagement. She looked exhausted, the kind of deep tiredness that came from hours of sustained focus under extreme pressure, yet she continued working with the same steady determination I had witnessed throughout the battle. "Colonel," I said, approaching her station, "may I ask you some questions about what I witnessed today?" She looked up from her display, gesturing for me to sit in the chair beside her station. "Go ahead. I imagine you have quite a few." I considered where to begin, uncertain how to properly frame everything I had observed, and struggled to understand. "The tactics your forces employed today defied everything I understood about human military doctrine. The willingness of your soldiers to hold impossible positions, the adaptability displayed throughout the engagement, none of this matches the reports the Dominion has compiled about your species." She leaned back in her chair, considering my words carefully before responding. "What did your reports say about us?" I hesitated, unsure how much honesty was appropriate given the circumstances, but decided that continued deception would serve no useful purpose. "That humans represent a soft and unreliable element within coalition forces, that your emotional nature and lack of rigid discipline made you a liability in serious military engagements." She laughed, though there was little humor in the sound. "I've heard variations of that assessment before, from other species who couldn't quite figure out how we operate. You're not the first to make that mistake, and you won't be the last." "Then help me understand," I said. "How does a species that shows such open emotion, that jokes and laughs even in the face of danger, produce soldiers capable of the resilience I witnessed today?" Colonel Reyes considered the question for a long moment, her eyes drifting toward the viewport that showed the damaged but still functional exterior of the station. "Humans have a complicated history," she finally said. "We spent most of our existence fighting for survival, against threats we couldn't fully control: disease, hunger, each other, the natural world itself. We learned a long time ago that pretending fear doesn't exist gets people killed. But we also learned that letting fear control every decision does the same thing." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "So we found a middle path. We acknowledge what scares us. We talk about it, joke about it, sometimes even sing about it. And then we choose to act anyway, because the alternative is letting fear make every decision for us." I processed her explanation carefully, comparing it against everything I had witnessed throughout the engagement. The dark humor exchanged between soldiers during the most dangerous moments of the battle, the open displays of concern for one another's well-being, the willingness to discuss fear openly rather than suppress it entirely. All of this began to fit into a coherent picture that I had previously failed to recognize. "There's something else too," she continued. "Something that took me years to understand myself when I first started leading soldiers into dangerous situations. Humans fight differently when we're fighting for people we care about, rather than simply following orders. Owen didn't hold that position today because I ordered him to. He held it because he understood that his squad mates and the soldiers behind him depended on that corridor staying secure. That kind of motivation runs deeper than simple obedience." I thought back to the moment when Owen Blake's small group had remained in their impossible position, choosing to hold their ground despite every opportunity to withdraw. Colonel Reyes was right. Their courage had not come from fear of punishment or blind adherence to military doctrine. It had come from something far more personal, a genuine connection to the people they were protecting. "This connection you describe," I said. "It seems to create significant vulnerability. If a soldier becomes too focused on protecting specific individuals, rather than following broader strategic objectives, Doesn't that risk compromising the overall mission? Colonel Reyes considered this carefully. Sometimes, yes. But more often, it's exactly what makes us effective. A soldier who genuinely cares about the people beside them will push themselves further than one who's simply following procedure. They'll find solutions that a purely tactical mindset might miss, because they're not just calculating odds, they're fighting for something that matters to them personally. I remained quiet for a moment, absorbing everything she had shared. The picture forming in my mind was far more complex than anything the Dominion's reports had prepared me to expect. Humanity's apparent softness, the emotional openness that had led my superiors to dismiss them as unreliable, was not a weakness at all. It was the foundation of a resilience that had allowed them to overcome odds that should have resulted in a decisive defeat. "May I ask you something else?" I said. "During the height of the engagement, when your forces appeared to be at their most vulnerable, I noticed your soldiers continued to exchange humor and casual conversation, even while facing immediate danger. This behavior seemed to contradict the seriousness of the situation. How does this help, rather than hinder your combat effectiveness?" She smiled slightly at the question, as though she had been asked something similar before. "Humor is how we remind ourselves that we're still human, even in the middle of chaos. It keeps panic from taking over. When you're laughing at something, even something small and stupid, your mind stays sharp enough to keep making good decisions. The moment fear takes over completely, that's when mistakes happen." I recorded her words carefully, understanding now that everything I had witnessed throughout the engagement fit into a broader pattern of human psychology that the Dominion had never properly studied or understood. Our reports had focused entirely on observable military tactics and formations, completely missing the underlying emotional and psychological factors that made those tactics effective in the first place. As our conversation continued into the late hours, other officers occasionally stopped by the command deck to share brief updates or simply check on Colonel Reyes's well-being after the demanding engagement. I watched these interactions with new understanding, recognizing now the genuine care and connection that ran throughout the human command structure, a stark contrast to the rigid hierarchy that governed Dominion military operations. Grace Bennett stopped by at one point, her flight suit still marked with the evidence of the battle she had just survived. "Colonel, I wanted to check in before I head to get some rest. Everyone in my squadron made it back safely." "Good work today, Grace," Colonel Reyes replied. "Get some sleep. You earned it." Grace nodded, glancing briefly in my direction with curiosity, before addressing the colonel once more. "Is our observer getting everything he needs?" "I believe so," Colonel Reyes said, glancing at me with a small, knowing smile. "Though I suspect he's learning quite a bit more than he expected to." I could not deny the truth in her words. Everything I had witnessed and learned since arriving at Halden Station had fundamentally challenged the assumptions I carried with me, forcing me to reconsider not just my understanding of human military capability, but the broader question of what actually constituted strength within a species. As the night wore on, I found myself reflecting on the events of the day with a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with fear of the Krail or concern for my own safety. Instead, I felt the uncomfortable weight of realizing that everything the Dominion believed about our newest coalition allies was fundamentally wrong, built on assumptions that had never been properly tested against the reality of human behavior under genuine pressure. I thought about the reports I had read before arriving at this assignment, confident assessments written by Dominion analysts who had never witnessed anything like what I had just experienced. They had studied human military formations, examined statistics regarding casualties and resource allocation, and drawn conclusions based entirely on surface-level observations that failed to account for the deeper psychological and emotional factors driving human behavior in combat. Colonel Reyes eventually rose from her station, stretching muscles that had clearly been tense for hours. "I need to get some rest before tomorrow's debriefing with Coalition Command," she said, "but I'm glad you were here to see this firsthand. Maybe your report will help correct some of the misunderstandings that have followed us since we joined the Coalition. I intend to write an entirely different report than the one my superiors expect," I said honestly. "What I witnessed today does not match anything in our previous assessments of human military capability." She studied me for a moment, something like genuine appreciation crossing her tired features. That's more than most outside observers manage to admit. Most people see what they expect to see, even when the evidence right in front of them tells a different story. As she prepared to leave the command deck, she paused and turned back toward me one final time. "There's something else you should understand, something that goes beyond tactics and strategy. What you saw today wasn't really about winning a battle. It was about people refusing to abandon each other, even when every logical calculation suggested they should. That's not weakness. That's the thing that makes us dangerous, in the best possible sense of that word." Her words remained with me long after she departed the command deck, settling into my thoughts alongside everything else I had witnessed throughout the engagement. I remained alone for a while, reviewing my recorded observations and beginning to draft the framework for a report that would challenge everything the Dominion believed about the species we had so casually dismissed as soft and unreliable. The station around me continued its quiet transition from active conflict to cautious recovery, soldiers moving through their post-battle routines with the same strange combination of exhaustion and resilience that had carried them through the engagement itself. I understood now that I had witnessed something far more significant than a simple military victory. I had witnessed the true nature of human strength, hidden beneath layers of emotional openness and casual behavior that had led outside observers like myself to fundamentally misunderstand what we were truly dealing with. As I finally made my way toward my assigned quarters, exhaustion beginning to settle over me after the long and demanding day, I found myself already anticipating the reaction my report would generate once it reached Dominion Command. Whatever conclusions my superiors had expected me to confirm, the reality I had witnessed told an entirely different story, one that would require a complete reassessment of how the Dominion understood its newest coalition allies. Sleep did not come easily that night, my mind still processing everything I had witnessed and learned throughout the engagement. Yet even as exhaustion finally began to overtake me, I understood that my time at Halden Station had fundamentally changed my understanding of what it truly meant to be strong in the face of overwhelming danger. Morning arrived at Halden Station with a strange quiet, the kind that follows any storm large enough to leave everyone involved slightly changed. I woke earlier than expected, my mind still turning over everything I had witnessed the day before, and made my way toward the station's observation deck, where I found Colonel Reyes already standing near the viewport, looking out at the scarred remains of the battlefield still visible in the distance. "You're up early," she said without turning to face me. "I could not sleep for long," I admitted. "There is too much to process from yesterday's engagement." She nodded slowly, still gazing out at the debris field that marked where the Krail fleet had been forced to retreat. "That's usually how it goes after something like this. The body wants rest, but the mind keeps working through it anyway." I stood beside her in silence for a while, both of us watching the slow drift of wreckage against the backdrop of distant stars. Eventually, I found myself asking a question that had been forming in my mind since the previous evening. "Colonel, I would like to walk through the battlefield, if that is possible. I believe seeing the aftermath directly would help me understand everything more completely before I finalize my report." She considered this for a moment, before nodding. "I can arrange that. Give me an hour to finish my morning briefing, and I'll take you out myself." True to her word, we departed the station roughly an hour later, aboard a small survey vessel, moving slowly through the debris field that marked the site of the previous day's engagement. The wreckage of both human and Krail vessels drifted silently in the void, a stark visual reminder of the cost involved in defending the mining colony from the Krail assault. "This is what most people never see," Colonel Reyes said quietly, as we moved through the debris field. "The reports focus on victory or defeat, on tactical outcomes and strategic advantages. They rarely capture what it actually costs to achieve those outcomes." I studied the wreckage carefully, recording everything with my equipment, while also simply absorbing the weight of what I was witnessing firsthand. "Your species has faced conflict throughout much of its recorded history, has it not? I recall Dominion records indicating a long history of warfare on your homeworld, before humanity achieved unified space travel." She sighed, though it was not an expression of frustration, so much as acknowledgement of a difficult truth. "That's putting it mildly. Humans spent thousands of years fighting each other before we finally figured out how to work together as a single species. We fought over land, resources, beliefs, sometimes over things that seem almost meaningless in hindsight. It's not something we're proud of, but it shaped who we became." "How did that history influence what I witnessed yesterday?" I asked. "The resilience, the adaptability, the willingness to sacrifice for one another despite overwhelming odds. Colonel Reyes guided the survey vessel around a particularly large piece of debris before answering. I think surviving that kind of history taught us something important about ourselves. We learned that giving up rarely solves anything. We learned that the people who make it through the worst situations aren't always the strongest or the smartest. Sometimes they're just the ones who refuse to quit, who find a way to keep moving forward even when everything seems impossible. I considered her words carefully, comparing them against everything I had witnessed throughout the engagement and my subsequent conversations with various members of the human command structure. The Dominion has fought the Krail for many generations. We have developed extensive strategic doctrine based on centuries of accumulated experience. Yet your forces, still relatively new to interstellar conflict, displayed tactics and resilience that exceeded anything I have witnessed from Dominion forces in similar engagements. She glanced at me, something thoughtful crossing her expression. Maybe that's because we're not just fighting according to doctrine. We're fighting according to instinct, shaped by everything our species has been through. It's not always pretty, and it's definitely not always efficient by the numbers, but it tends to work when it matters most. We continued through the debris field in contemplative silence for a while, the vast emptiness surrounding us, broken only by the occasional drift of wreckage catching distant starlight. Eventually, Colonel Reyes guided the vessel back toward the station, our survey of the battlefield complete. "There's something else I think you should understand," she said, as we approached the station's docking bay. "What you witnessed yesterday wasn't really about proving anything to the Dominion or the rest of the coalition. It was about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, about honoring the trust that comes with being part of something larger than ourselves. That's the part that gets lost when people just look at tactics and outcomes." Her words settled into my thoughts as we docked the survey vessel and made our way back through the station's corridors. I spent the remainder of the day reviewing my recorded observations, speaking with various soldiers who had participated in the previous day's engagement, and slowly constructing a report that would challenge everything Dominion Command believed about our human allies. I spoke with Grace Bennett about her decision to lead her squadron into a dangerous flanking maneuver to relieve Owen Blake's position. "I didn't think about it as dangerous," she told me. "I just knew Owen needed help, and I was in a position to give it. Everything else just followed from there." I spoke with Henry Cross about his promise to hold the failing perimeter shield for 3 minutes, despite the colonel only requesting 2. "You make promises like that because you understand what's at stake," he explained. "It's not about following orders perfectly. It's about doing whatever it takes to keep everyone safe." I spoke with Owen Blake about his decision to hold an impossible position despite every opportunity to withdraw. "I thought about my squad, about the people counting on that corridor staying secure," he said simply. "Sometimes you just have to trust that holding the line matters more than your own safety." Each conversation added another layer to my understanding of what I had witnessed, painting a picture of humanity far more complex and admirable than anything the Dominion's previous assessments had suggested. These were not soldiers motivated purely by duty or fear of consequences. They were individuals bound together by genuine care for one another, willing to make impossible choices because they understood the weight of what they were protecting. As evening approached, I found myself once again in conversation with Colonel Reyes, this time in the quiet privacy of her personal quarters, rather than the bustling activity of the command deck. She had invited me to share a simple meal before my scheduled departure the following morning, an act of hospitality that surprised me, given the formal distance typically maintained between Dominion officers and outside observers. "I wanted to thank you for your honesty throughout your time here," she said as we sat together. "It's rare for outside observers to actually update their views based on what they witness, rather than simply confirming what they expected to find. What I witnessed here has fundamentally changed my understanding of your species," I admitted. The Dominion believed humanity represented a weakness within coalition forces, a soft and unreliable element that required careful management. What I have learned instead is that your apparent softness, the emotional openness and personal connection that seemed like vulnerability from the outside, is actually the foundation of a resilience that exceeds anything I have witnessed from more traditionally disciplined forces. Colonel Reyes considered my words carefully before responding. "I think that's something a lot of species struggle to understand about us. We're not soft because we lack strength. We're strong precisely because we allow ourselves to feel things deeply, to care about each other openly, and to draw on that connection when everything else seems impossible. There is something else I have come to understand, I said, choosing my words carefully. The Dominion has always measured strength through discipline, through the suppression of emotion, in favor of pure, calculated efficiency. Yet what I witnessed here suggests that true strength may require the opposite approach, an acceptance of emotion and connection rather than its suppression. She nodded slowly. That's exactly it. Fear doesn't disappear just because you refuse to acknowledge it. It just goes underground, where it can do more damage than if you'd simply faced it directly. We've learned that acknowledging fear, laughing at it sometimes, talking about it openly, actually makes us more capable of pushing through it when it matters most. Our conversation continued late into the evening, covering topics ranging from the broader history of human conflict to the specific challenges of coordinating diverse coalition forces against a common threat. By the time I finally returned to my assigned quarters for what would be my final night at Halden Station, I understood that my report to Dominion Command would need to address far more than simple tactical observations. The following morning, as I prepared to depart the station and return to Dominion territory, Colonel Reyes met me at the docking bay to see me off personally. "Safe travels," she said, extending her hand in the same gesture she had offered when we first met days earlier. This time, I understood the meaning behind it, and I accepted the handshake without hesitation. "Thank you for allowing me to witness everything I did during my time here," I said. "I believe my report will finally provide Dominion Command with a more accurate understanding of what humanity truly represents within the coalition forces." She smiled, though there was something bittersweet in her expression, as though she understood better than I did how difficult it might be for entrenched institutional beliefs to shift based on a single report. "Whatever you write, just make sure it's honest. That's all any of us can really ask for." As my transport departed Halden Station and began the long journey back toward Dominion territory, I found myself reviewing everything I had witnessed and learned throughout my assignment. The battle itself had been dramatic enough, a testament to human adaptability and resilience under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Yet it was the conversations that followed, the quiet moments of reflection and honest explanation offered by Colonel Reyes and her soldiers, that had truly transformed my understanding of the species I had arrived expecting to dismiss. I spent the journey composing my final report, choosing my words carefully to convey everything I had witnessed without diminishing its significance through overly cautious language. I described the tactical brilliance displayed during the engagement, the willingness of individual soldiers to sacrifice their own safety for the protection of others, and the remarkable psychological resilience that allowed humans to maintain effectiveness even in the most desperate circumstances. But I also included something that I suspected my superiors would find far more difficult to accept than simple tactical observations. I wrote that humanity's strength did not come from suppressing emotion or maintaining rigid discipline in the way Dominion forces had always valued. Instead, it came from an entirely different source, a willingness to acknowledge fear and vulnerability openly, to build genuine connections between soldiers that transcended simple military hierarchy, and to draw on those connections as a source of strength rather than viewing them as weakness. I concluded my report with words that I knew would challenge everything the Dominion believed about our newest coalition allies. Humans were not dangerous because they possessed overwhelming military strength or technological superiority. They were dangerous, in the truest and most respectful sense of that word, because they had learned something that many older and more established species had never fully grasped. Strength did not require the elimination of vulnerability. Sometimes, the greatest strength came from embracing that vulnerability fully and choosing to act with courage despite it, rather than in denial of it. My report reached Dominion Command several weeks later, and though I never received official confirmation of how it was received, I later learned through informal channels that it had been quietly circulated among strategic analysts throughout coalition territory, studied carefully by species who had previously shared the same dismissive assumptions about humanity that I had once held myself. I often think back to my time at Halden Station, to the conversations I shared with Colonel Reyes and her soldiers, and to the battle that had fundamentally altered my understanding of what it truly meant to be strong. The galaxy had spent generations measuring strength through discipline, technology, and raw military power. Humanity had shown, through quiet acts of courage and genuine connection between individuals, that there was another kind of strength entirely, one that could not be easily replicated by species who had never learned to embrace vulnerability as humanity had. I understood, finally, why the galaxy had begun to regard humanity with a mixture of respect and caution that went beyond simple military assessment. It was not fear of their weapons or their tactics that commanded this attention. It was recognition of something far more difficult to counter, a resilience born from genuine connection and a refusal to abandon each other, even when every logical calculation suggested that giving up would be the wiser choice. That, I came to understand, was the true source of humanity's strength, and it was a lesson that would remain with me long after my assignment at Halden Station had ended.